Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, friends, and especially map lovers, welcome to the lecture War Damage and Destruction Maps, Representation of Cities 1939 to 1949 by our dear colleague Carmen Enss from the University of Bamberg, which is taking place here at the main representative seat of the Czech Academy of Sciences. The lecture is organized by the Historical Geography Research Center of the Institute of History of the Czech Academy of Sciences in cooperation with the Collegium Carolinum. I would like to welcome both in-person participants as well as our online attendees. Just please let me know, those who are online, if you can hear and see us well. Just do something if you hear us. Okay, thank you, Václav. Okay, I don't want to speak for long, so let me just briefly introduce our special guest. Dr. Carmen Maria Enss is a monument conservationist, historian of cartography. Are you a historian of cartography? Yes, she is. And currently head of the research network Urban Metamapping. Since 2017, she's been a researcher at the Competence Center for Monument Sciences and Technologies at the Otto Friedrich University of Bamberg, where she also leads the Bamberg sub-project Bestand and the DFG project Recording War Damage in World War II Europe. Carmen studied architecture and conservation in Weimar, Munich, Trondheim, and Bamberg. After practical work in historic preservation, she returned to university and completed her doctorate in architectural history at the Technical University of Munich with a thesis on post-war reconstruction. She completed several research stays as a visiting scholar at the Biblioteca Hertziana in Rome, where she conducted research on urban planning and monument preservation in fascist Italy. In recent years, Carmen's main research interest has been the study of maps, recording and documenting the World War II damage and their significance for further urban development, as well as for mapping processes in general. I find Carmen's interdisciplinary approach very inspiring, and that's why I'm very much looking forward to her talk today. Carmen, the platform is yours.
Colleagues, for most European cities and countries, the Second World War was the last war that directly affected them, that affected towns, villages, and landscapes. The crimes of the Nazis caused countless deaths in camps, ghettos, and on the front lines. At the same time, radical changes began to take place in the cities. Entire neighborhoods were rendered unusable through bombings. In some parts of Europe, it was the air war that caused widespread damage and destruction. Well, I try to move forward. So this target map of Liverpool by the German Luftwaffe is a war map that helped prepare the attacks. And the German term Blitz then also stands for this type of warfare in English. So I just want to refer to the international dimension because I will mostly present material from Germany and just to have this historical context. However, in my talk today, I will concentrate on the destruction and damage to cities and civilian cities, city life, and not on the war itself. So I'm not showing you war maps after this map. In contrast to this war map, published by Jeremy Black, damage maps were often created to overcome the damage and to remember the devastation. What are damage maps and how can they be defined? This damage map from Hamburg shows the complexity of the documentation of damages. And we will have a closer look to the map now. According to the scholar Niels Gutschow, this thematic map was created immediately after the war in 1945. At that time, the attacks were 2 years it was 2 years ago that the main attacks came to Hamburg. Georg Felix Sedelmeier recently discovered this map in the Hamburg archives. 6 air raids shown in different colors in the map had taken place almost 2 years earlier. For example, damage from the 28th July 1943 was shown in blue. So large parts of the city were covered in blue. Areas of total damage were shown in full blue. Heavy damage was hatched in blue, and light damage was dotted in blue in the outskirts of Hamburg. But it was not only damage that was shown in this map, but also a restricted area. It's called here Totes Gebiet or Sperrgebiet. And this was a walled area in the city where only authorized people could enter because of the high damages. Although this map of Hamburg is strictly speaking a history map because it shows past events, it had a direct link to the present. And this link was that the damages still existed at that time, and also that this restricted area outlined still existed. So in our research, we look at thematic city maps like this that are directly related to the events of war. We call this body of objects war damage maps in general. So it's a quite various body of maps that we just call this war damage maps. In most cases, as in this example, damage was not mapped on its own, but connected to some other aspects of the city, like to surviving buildings, to the type of damage, or to urban planning and reconstruction. Damage maps help us to better understand 3 aspects of urban history. First one is the destruction itself. The second one is the response to damage through disaster management. And the third one is the early phase of reconstruction, the early planning period. The map of Hamburg is just part of a series of successive thematic maps of the city. The mapping of damage began immediately after the first air raids and only ended in the post-war era. So in the next, I think, 30 minutes or so, I would like to present the research that has been carried out at the University of Bamberg over the past 5 years, more or less. Our research is funded by the German Research Foundation. This was this first project, and is now funded by the Federal Ministry for Research and Education. And our current research project is called Urban Meta Mapping. You might have been to our urban meta mapping online talks, which are monthly, and you are all invited to join them if you haven't been there. I'm the initiator of the Urban Meta Mapping group, and my projects in Bamberg here are marked in green, so this DFG and the Urban Meta Mapping project. But I applied for this Urban Meta Mapping group together with my colleagues from other institutions in Germany. So we are an international group of researchers from Poland, Romania, UK, Austria, and Germany, but all based in German institutions. There are some sub-projects that work with planning specifically, with discourse analysis. My colleague is literature scholar, and with social cartography, and also with this focus on heritage mapping. But I will come to this again at the end of the talk. So today I mostly will show you work from our recent issued Atlas Kriegsschadenskarten, and the book is here, so you can also have a look inside if you like. And the research was a collaborative effort together with my colleague Birgit Knauer, now at the University of Vienna, and my colleague Georg Felix Sedelmeier, also from Bamberg. So Georg went to the archives mostly and digged up maps, and Birgit and I, as postdocs, we examined the maps and organized them in a database, and now issued the atlas. But all of us are authors within this atlas book. So I'm presenting not only my own work, but this is what I was saying. Yeah, the structure of the font. Would you like? Yeah, my structure now for the next minutes is threefold. The first part is about the phenomenon of war damage maps a little bit more in detail. The second one is a case study of Nuremberg, where there are many war damage maps. And the third part is on our current research and future research based on war damage maps. Maybe also interesting for you to connect somehow from Prague and other places. Yeah, I start with the phenomenon of war damage maps. In 2005, Robin Wolfen described World War II damages that were mapped in London already. So he explained and examined how the damages actually were mapped down in the field, and how these sketches then were redrawn for the big London war damage map, which is also published. Later, in 2012, my colleague Jerzy Elżanowski described damage mapping in his seminal essay, Ruins, Rubble and Human Remains, Negotiating Culture and Violence in Post-Catastrophic Warsaw. So he analyzed the damage mapping process for Warsaw, and I will use his paper here just to introduce you into this process. In 1945, the Warsaw Reconstruction Office BOSS employed many building experts who went through the city plot by plot, mapped the damages in hand sketches, and described it on the spot. You can see here these sketches. They made hand-drawn maps and also some notes on the maps. You will be better able to read the notes than I, because they are in Polish. And after this work, the maps, all these notes came back to the office, and in the office, the handmade maps were redrawn to a big map based on the cadastral map of Warsaw. You see here on the left hand all the cadastral sheets and tiles to get added together to a gigantic map, 7 to 7 meters, if you add it all together. And on the right hand side, you can see just a section of this map, and you can see that every building footprint, every outline of the building was separately mapped. This is the legend for this vast damage map, and you have 9 different categories showing in detail which type of damage occurred to the buildings. So this famous Warsaw war damage map today is part of the UNESCO document heritage and is also available online. But this did not remain the only war damage map for Warsaw. That right after the war, there was a publication called Warszawa Jaka Była, where there was a map in the appendix also showing the damages to the city, but this map used other categories. And the categories in this map, they explain how the damages were done. And it's in a way a simplified form of the huge map. We can observe this often, that for publication, maps were simplified and sometimes also connected to political communication, and therefore reinterpreted. The damages were reinterpreted and told, and it's part of a bigger narrative of the city transformation. Yeah. So my colleague Georg Felix Sedelmeier, he made a structure for this damage mapping process. He found three stages of damage mapping. First one is the recording on the spot in the field. The second one is this redrawing, what we saw, the combination of the material from plots and the evaluation of this data, sometimes in combination with other aspects. And the third stage, which we haven't seen yet, is combination of damage maps with city planning, which we also find in many cities. And I have three examples from German cities to these three stages. The first one is again from Hamburg, and it shows, it's from 1943. It shows where the incidents of the bombings actually hit the city. And if you look into the enlarged area, you can even see and observe where the airplanes crushed that had been hit and destroyed, where they crashed down to the city and also caused damage and destruction. So this is a very, very detailed map on the spot, which was then redrawn in the next stage to the map you already saw. I have another map from the city of Nuremberg for this second stage, which is somehow comparable to the Warsaw map I showed you, to the huge map. This is called Geprüfter Gesamtschadensplan. So this is one map from Nuremberg, which was done after the war ending in December 1945. This map is very, very detailed and also has several categories. However, it is only made for the central part of the city, within the walls. In Nuremberg, there were not so many people working in this field, and they just concentrated on the core of the city. And for the third stage, for this planning stage, I show you a plan from Hanover from 1948. This is the city close to where I come from, also heavily damaged. And this plan is an architectural city planning plan. Yeah, it was made, it is a proposition for reconstruction planning. And the base map for this architectural design is actually the damage map for Hanover. You can see, I try to show you here. In this area, and I will show this to the audience online. In this part of the city, you can see just the base map, and with the still existing and surviving buildings marked in gray. And in the city center, there are very few surviving buildings, and therefore on top of these buildings and of the former city plan, the new planning has been drawn. This is also quite typical for a quite typical phenomenon of combination of damage mapping and reconstruction planning. Yes, at that point, I come to my second part about Nuremberg. With Prague in the center, Nuremberg is not so far from here. I will talk about Nuremberg and also show you one map later from Munich and one map from Vienna. Yeah, Nuremberg was this very important city from medieval and Renaissance time, but it was also showcase to the Nazi party congresses, which took place since the 1920s, and therefore it was also for Nazi Germany quite an important city. It was also an industrial city, and therefore it was bombed. Here is a compilation of 8 damage maps from Nuremberg. You can see in the upper row of this compilation the increasing damage from the left with the first bomb incidents. To the right, with the heavy damages that had occurred until the end of the war. And in the row below, you can see first steps towards post-war planning. And I will come and go through these plans now in detail. Most of the plans you will see later now. So the first map, I wanted to say that these maps have different scales. I just overlaid them and georeferenced them in order to just focus on center, so that it gets somehow comparable for you. So for example, this map was a vast, huge map showing the whole city and the bombings, and you can even see the carpet bombings where the bombs fell. And this is just the city center where you can see bomb incidents of two types of bombings marked in red, and also burnt areas marked in black and hatched in black. So at the beginning, they started quite elaborate mapping efforts, and every air raid was mapped at like this. But then very quickly they understood that, yeah, it's hopeless. The damages increase, and they developed other mapping techniques because of this. So in this map from 1944, already not only the incidents were mapped, but the areas that were covered with damages. And you can see old damages from former air raids in blue and new added damages in red. And so these types of maps were redone after the bombings. So you can find this color pattern also later. This is quite an interesting map. It was made for the German Ministry of War. There was a group of architects and urban planners called Arbeitsstab Wiederaufbauplanung, and they secretly tried to imagine reconstruction during the war here in 1944, because they saw, large parts of the cities would have to be reinvented and reconstructed. And this group of architects, they wanted to find out those areas where something new could be developed in the city. So you can see that they draw very simplified maps compared to the former ones. The red hatched areas, they show 50% damages, or even 80% damages, or 70% damages, I think. And in these areas, they saw the potential to create something new. Then we have a map from, again, from 1944. You cannot really see this, but I tell you, it's from 1944. It's a map that doesn't show the damages actually, but that shows the cleared areas, those areas of the cities that already had been cleared from the damages. And often if we find maps and we don't have a legend, then we don't know exactly what they show. And interestingly, sometimes they just prepare the rubble clearance, or they show where rubble already had been cleared. And this is a map from the end of the war. Again, you see the existing or the former damages in blue and the new damages in red. And yeah, you can see, especially in the northeastern quadrant of the city, nearly everything had been destroyed, and it was marked as totally damaged. We will later have a closer look to this area of the city. To this part of the city. Near this main square, which here was still named Adolf Hitler Platz, but it's in other times of history of the city, and now it's just called Marketplace. Yeah, and now we come to the plan you already know from my first part. You can see here the very detailed detailed legend. Vast parts of the city were covered in yellow, which meant total damages. But we can also see upstanding and surviving buildings and even walls. So this is a very detailed description of the city, which was prepared probably for catastrophic response and in combination for planning. Because if we can find another map, which was then printed based on the former map, and this printed map was distributed also to architects in order to prepare their reconstruction plans. Now this is an interesting map. It says Zustand 1945, which we can imagine that it has not been drawn in 1945 because it says it was then, it's the state of 1945. This is a damage map. You see vast areas of the city just in white, and just some of the buildings marked as still standing upright buildings, still surviving buildings. So this is again a simplified version of the damage map, and probably because it was done quite lavishly, probably it was done to present it to the public. And also in Nuremberg, some democratic elements were built in the reconstruction process. So there was some citizens were asked about their opinion how to rebuild the city, and probably this map was drawn within this process. Yeah, I now come to another map, which is quite typical for many cities, at least in Germany. There are some proposed radical solutions for reconstruction. This was done and prepared in the city planning office. However, the city didn't decide to do so, but at least there were some ideas to just plan something completely new in the city. And even this plan is based on a damage map. If you look closer, you can see that surviving buildings are marked in, appear here, and even very small surviving structures are included in this plan. But most of the still existing structures had not been part of the planning here. They just wanted to do something new. Yeah, and now this is the last damage map from Nuremberg. I show you today, it's from 1952. And it shows again just the damages, but also we have a new category, which is orange. And these buildings are rebuilt buildings. So in 1952, already some of the buildings, again, were new buildings. So the reconstruction already had begun at that point. I just show you some real pictures so that you can somehow compare the maps with aerial photographs. So this is a photograph of this northeastern part of the city center called Desert. Steppe. It was the nickname of this area because it was so heavily damaged. This is a photo from 47. And in 1950, already the rubble and also the surviving walls had been cleared. So we really had a tabula rasa situation in this part of the city. But interestingly, the city did not decide to do something completely new. But as you can see from a map that my student created, based on the pre-war Nuremberg map, the black lines shown in the map, they show today's built-up area. So the buildings are new, however, the street grid more or less remained the same, interestingly. So the city of Nuremberg, they decided, although having this tabula rasa situation, to just create, more or less the same situation again. without doing facsimile reconstruction, but yeah, with new buildings, as you can see here on the right. Nuremberg also had the policy to incorporate some parts of important historical buildings into new architecture, as you can see here with this Heller house. I like this quite famous example of a Renaissance palais which had collapsed, and there was new architecture added, and the basement or the first floor is still the old one, and on top of that something new was done. And in the rear part, in the courtyard part, also Renaissance parts, more Renaissance parts remained there. Yeah, by the way, this map done from my student is from the student's brochure, which is also online. You can download it and look into more Nuremberg maps if you like. Yeah. Now I will move to my last part. We'll have some minutes left. So Nuremberg is one example here marked in white. But for the new project, the Urban Meta Mapping Group, we are looking not only in German cities, but in cities in some European countries, because I have these international colleagues. We look into cities in Poland, in Austria, in Romania, in Moldavia, and we also wanted to go to the border to Ukraine. However, we had to change our research plan, so probably we will just stick to the western part of Poland and compare the mapping and reconstruction of these cities to those, for example, of the socialist parts of Germany, because it's interesting. They probably had the same pre-war or war maps, and then just created new maps from these maps in post-war times, in different maps, in different languages, etc., and maybe also in different kinds of ways of mapping. So I'm curious about the research my colleagues are doing here. And I would like now to move to the research based on war damage maps we are currently conducting. And I come to first to this aspect of city planning. This is also a little bit my own hobby. And I can show you here a map from Munich, where I did my dissertation, and talk a little bit about this plan on the left-hand side, which is a damage map as a base map. On top of this damage map, we have a proposed ring road. So this is a combination of damage mapping and planning again. And it's a little bit the question how this combination actually comes. This plan was printed in a brochure or pamphlet called Das Neue München. So it was a proposal for reconstruction planning by the city architect Carmen Maria Enss. And Meitinger created this map in his city office and overlaid it with this trace for the ring road. He wanted to argue that in post-war reconstruction should be used in order to improve infrastructure in the city and to implement this new ring road. Jeffrey Diefendorf already observed this in the 1980s, that in post-war cities, often these ring roads were implemented. And this was the case in Munich. And the map looks and it tells the narrative that the city is destroyed, and therefore we can just introduce a new road. However, if you look more closely into the southern part of the ring road, you can see that actually many black and blue buildings are there directly. So the road should cross existing and surviving structures. And it was not directly connected to war damage. If the center, right, the yellow areas, they were damaged and not these 19th century roads around the city. So actually this connection between post-war planning and reconstruction is not really true. And this is also what Peter Larkham observed in a general article on post-catastrophic reconstruction, that very often there is a combination of general modernization with this, just the occasion to rebuild something. And you can see this again on the reconstruction proposal on the right-hand side of this page. Yeah, that actually this ring road just crossed through existing urban fabric. And the actual ring road idea and planning came from the interwar period, but at that time, no one would have done this, because the city was standing there and no one would have bought all these sites just to build a new road. So this direct combination between planning and damage is not always true. Yeah, one other field that interests me is urban conservation. And this is research I did together with my colleague Birgit Knauer. I show you a new map from Nuremberg that you don't know yet. This is not a damage map, but the map was drawn in preparation for the vast bombings. This is a historical value level map. It shows historical, so the level of historical value. The highest level was marked in black. Very important buildings were marked in red, and historic buildings were marked in blue. So you can see that the whole northern part of the city somehow was covered with valuable architecture. This map was created probably for the firefighters in order so that they knew what to stabilize. And it's very interesting that this is the first heritage map for Nuremberg, and this is the case for some cities in Germany, that this aspect of urban cartography comes new into the field of cartography. However, maybe in Prague or other cities, I don't know, at least in Vienna, we have these building age plans that show historical, that show the age of buildings for cities that were created already at the beginning of the 20th century. So we see here a continuity, and at least for German cities, we see a boost of heritage mapping that also continued after the war. Here you have again a section from this geprüfter Gesamtschadensplan, from this post-war plan for Nuremberg. You can see that the historical buildings are drawn in huge detail, and that even some existing walls, like facades here, were marked separately in order to show that they were still standing upright. And in addition to this map also continued information about valuable objects, like figures at the facades, etc., that should be covered during rubble clearance, and that they were actually recovered to save places and were later implemented in the new architecture. Yeah, I think, urban narratives. There is an open call of my colleague Elisa Maria Hima for a conference this year in Marburg. And she looks about, you cannot see this, urban narratives, rebuilding and rebranding European cities from the 20th century until present. And she wants to find out about mappings and narrations, for example, for from tourist guides or for guides to the cities, how they rebranded cities post-war and in other circumstances. So this is one branch of our research. Yeah, and the last example is social cartography. My colleague Carol Ludwig, who conducts one of these sub-projects, together with Serafim Alvanides, they just published a special issue in the journal Urban Planning. And they used the same Nuremberg maps as we used and developed a bomb damage index. They mapped then the damages based on these data to a district level to make these damage indexes comparable to social data. So they want to explore the long-term effects of bombing and of the way how cities were rebuilt, and are doing really interesting also quantitative research. Yes. And at that point, I come to my conclusion, putting the events of war damage and response to war damage in a sequence and progression helps for a better understanding of what happened in detail in the cities. In some cases, simplified damage maps were drawn for an easy to understand explanation of the events for a wider public. Maps were also simplified for political decision making. Some city planners or architects wanted to take advantage of the damages for modernization. For example, the deserted area of Nuremberg, though, indicates that war damage was not related to radical modernization. Some cities like Nuremberg, Munich, Augsburg, or other cities in Austria were heavily damaged, just like Hamburg, but their appearance in cityscapes does not look entirely changed compared to surviving cities and towns. And these cities did in-depth documentation of damages in surviving built structures. At least we can find these maps still today. This correlation between documenting of surviving structures and preservation of these structures leads to a recommendation for thorough damage documentation in our current conflicts and catastrophic events. Today, I presented mostly maps from cities in Germany, and I am really grateful that my colleagues from the Urban Meta Mapping Consortium and many scholars presenting at the Urban Meta Mapping talks can open an international perspective on damage cartographies. And we are currently putting together a volume, cartographies of catastrophes, which also includes international dimensions and is not only focused on World War II. With this note on the field of historical damage cartography in general, I'm concluding this talk, and thank you all for listening.